Well, Tibetan Pure Land, or Pure Land orientations in Tibet, to be more precise, is a very important subject of scholarship. And what I find striking when I started working on this topic is the lack of research on an orientation, a Buddhist orientation, which is very dominant in Tibet. It has been from the beginning, and it has evolved to such an extent that there's many genres around Pure Land literature, which are represented throughout all schools of Tibetan Buddhism. And that's on the one hand. And the second is there's a lot of literary material. There's a lot of texts which are unique to Tibetan Buddhism. Traditionally, one way of dividing material between sutra-based material, Tantric, the Tibetans would say, well, Tantric texts would require initiation for one thing. They would require a Tantric Vajrayana teacher who would need to both initiate you to the text and at the same time explain to you what the practice is. Whereas sutra-based Pure Land texts do not require the presence of a teacher. Anyone can pick them up, anyone can read them and practice them. Whereas with Tantra, things become a little bit more complicated because they're considered esoteric texts that require the presence of a teacher. It's very prominent when it comes down to both the monastics and the lay population. Pure Land rituals, especially as far as funeral rituals go, are very important, have always been central. There are many practices associated with Buddha Amitabha and Sukhavati that have to do with assisting the recently departed to go to the other world, the in-between worlds, what they call the bardo, between death and rebirth. So in that sense, they're very prominent. We find them throughout the Himalayan regions nowadays. I think it's still practiced in Tibet and all around Tibet. And there are various lineages and approaches to it, but basically, if I were to generalize, they all involve the practice of Poa, which is central to Pure Land Buddhism in Tibet. And Poa is the technique by which one transfers one's consciousness, subtle consciousness, directly to Sukhavati. And this can be done by a lama, which is an expert for someone who had recently died, or if one is trained in this technique, one can do it oneself. What I realized by coming here and coming in contact with all the speakers and listening to their presentations is how important Pure Land Buddhism is throughout Asia. I would even go as far as to say this is a pan-Asian and pan-Buddhist phenomenon, that it is kind of unfortunate that certain biases in the scholarly world have prevented thorough research and study of the material. This is not only, I mean, as far as I can see and tell, is that Pure Land Buddhism was important also in India, maybe not as a movement, but the whole notion of Pure Lands we encounter in all of Mahayana sutras. So it becomes a trope or a metaphor for discoursing on the entire Mahayana path. And this is as true in the Indian material as it is in the Tibetan. And of course, when it comes to Japan, although I'm not an expert, I am impressed at the level of sophistication by which Japanese scholars have reflected on the notion of Pure Land and how deep theologically they have elaborated on some of those premises. I think the most important obstacle that I see in Western scholarship on the topic is this idea of a European construction of pure Buddhism, that somehow there is such thing as an original or pure Buddhism, which is traced back to Sravakayana Buddhism or early primitive Buddhism. And somehow I think because this was the first encounter that the West had with Buddhism was through the early material, they had a very hard time accepting the fact that Buddhism is an organic and living thing, and it has developed in India over time and in different places. And I think this resistance to acknowledging the development, the natural progression of this movement has been an obstacle. Of course, the primary purpose of all this imagery is not aesthetic, so it's liturgical. So unlike in the West where we can appreciate things on aesthetic merit, that's not so in the Tibetan tradition, where all these depictions of the Pure Land and the Buddhas are meant to inspire the practitioner towards this practice, towards Pure Land practice. So it's a practical aspect which is mainly liturgical and meditative and inspirational, I would say. So this is kind of the function of Pure Land iconography in the Tibetan context. Well, from the Tibetan point of view, from the Tibetan tradition, of course Pure Land orientations are very much respected, and as I said before, there are many different layers of interpretation. Accessing many of the esoteric works has not been easy. And I think that's just not easy in general to access those manuscripts. And even if you access them, to actually get a Tibetan Buddhist scholar to explain to you their meaning, that can be a challenge. As far as one, because from a Buddhist point of view, those texts are not meant to be objects of academic study. They are actual manuals of enlightenment. So in that sense, there is a certain mistrust by a living tradition, Buddhist living tradition. Why would you want to study those texts independent of the context of the practice? So this has always been a challenge, and I think not a challenge only for me, but other scholars of Tibetan Buddhism, to actually gain the confidence and the trust of the Tibetans that one of the reasons that we're studying this is also to preserve them and also to make them available to a wider audience.